They stopped my surgery 2 hours before it started. That's not supposed to happen. Not after 11 months. Not after the scans, the approvals, the waiting, the planning. Not when you're already in the hospital bed, wearing that thin gown, your name printed on a plastic wristband like everything is already decided. And definitely not without a reason. So let me ask you something. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. If a hospital cancels your surgery at the last possible moment and refuses to tell you why, would you just nod and walk away? Because that's exactly what I did. 5:42 a.m. That's the first thing I remember clearly. The clock on the wall. Red numbers. Too bright for that early in the morning. I was already prepped. IV in my arm, heart monitor attached. They'd woken me up at 4:30, run through the same questions again. Name, date of birth, allergies, like a ritual before something permanent. My surgery was scheduled for 7:30. Spinal correction, not optional, not cosmetic. Something that had been slowly getting worse for years until it started affecting how I walked, how I slept, how I lived. 11 months. That's how long it took to get to that morning. Consultations, insurance approvals, physical therapy, weeks of waiting just to get on the surgical calendar. Rearranging my job, my apartment, my entire life around recovery. Everything led to that day. And then, the door opened. A nurse walked in first. Didn't smile. Didn't even look at me right away. She started checking the IV line like she needed something to do with her hands. Then Dr. Reeves stepped in behind her. He'd been my surgeon from the beginning. 52. Calm voice, precise. The kind of doctor who made you feel like everything was under control, even when it wasn't. But that morning, something was off. He didn't sit down, didn't come closer, just stood there at the foot of the bed, and then he said it. "We're going to have to postpone your surgery." Just like that. No build-up, no explanation, postpone. I remember blinking at him like maybe I misheard. "Postpone?" I asked. He nodded once, tight, controlled. "You'll have to wait." That was it. No timeline, no reason, no apology that felt real, just final. Now, here's the strange part. I didn't argue. I didn't panic. I didn't demand answers. I just nodded. "Okay," I said. Even now, I don't fully understand why. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was trust. Or maybe some part of me noticed what my brain hadn't caught up to yet. Because something in that room didn't feel normal. The nurse disconnected my IV too quickly, like she was in a rush to be done with me. Dr. Reeves avoided eye contact the entire time he explained nothing. And then they left. Just like that. A few minutes later, I was alone again. No monitor beeping, no IV. Just silence. I got dressed slowly. My hands were steady, but everything else felt delayed. Like my reaction hadn't caught up yet. When I stepped out into the hallway, I saw something that didn't make sense. Another patient, already being wheeled toward the operating room. The same operating room. My time slot. At the front desk, I asked one question. "When will it be rescheduled?" The woman behind the computer gave me a polite smile, the kind that doesn't mean anything. "We'll contact you." That was it. By the time I got home, it still didn't feel real. My hospital wristband was still on my arm. I hadn't taken it off yet. I sat on my couch, still dressed in the same clothes I wore to the hospital, staring at nothing for a long time. Then, slowly, something shifted. because the more I replayed it, the less it made sense. No warning, no explanation, no urgency, but also no transparency. And that's when one question started to form. Not why was it canceled, but what weren't they telling me? That night, around 11:18 p.m., I opened my laptop. No anger, no panic, just focus. I logged into my patient portal first. My surgery status had changed. Postponed. Pending review. Pending what review? There were no notes, no messages, nothing. Except for one thing. A document. Uploaded at 3:12 a.m., labeled Internal Review Update. I clicked it. Access denied. That's when I stopped being confused and started paying attention. Because why would there be an internal review hours before my surgery that I wasn't allowed to see? So I opened a new email. I didn't write to my doctor. I didn't write to the hospital front desk. I scrolled all the way down the hospital website into a section most patients never look at. Compliance, oversight, names buried under policy pages. And I picked one. My message was short, precise. No emotion, no accusations. Just a request. And when I hit send, I had no idea. That one email was about to force them to respond to something they had already decided to hide. They didn't cancel my surgery because of my health. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, quietly, like something I wasn't supposed to notice. Because if this had been about my condition, if something in my body had suddenly changed, they would have told me, right? That's what doctors do. They explain. They warn you. They prepare you. But none of that happened. Let me take you back a little. 11 months earlier, I was sitting in a completely different office, hearing the words that set everything in motion. You'll need surgery. Dr. Alan Reeves said it calmly, like he'd said it 1,000 times before. Maybe he had. He walked me through the scans, pointed out the problem area in my spine, explained how it would worsen over time if left untreated. There was no pressure in his voice, just certainty. And that certainty was convincing. Over the next few months, he became the center of everything. Every appointment, every update, every decision. He was precise, always on time, always composed. The kind of doctor you trust because he doesn't seem like he guesses. And I followed everything he told me to do. Physical therapy twice a week, diet adjustments, pre-op preparation checklists. I didn't miss a single step. Because when someone tells you they're going to fix something that's been affecting your life every single day, you listen. But looking back now, there were moments that didn't quite fit. Small things, easy to ignore at the time. Like 3 weeks before the surgery, I got a call from the hospital saying they needed additional imaging. No urgency, no concern in their tone, just routine. But when I asked why, the answer was vague. Just to confirm everything. Confirm what? They didn't say. Then there was the insurance delay. For a week, everything stalled. No approvals, no updates. And then suddenly, overnight, it all cleared. Approved, scheduled, locked in. Too smooth. At the time, I was relieved. Now, it feels different. And then there was the phone call, 5 days before surgery. A nurse called to go over final instructions. Everything sounded normal until I asked one simple question. Has anything changed since my last scan? There was a pause. Not long, just enough to notice. Then she said, "No, everything is on track." But her tone? It wasn't confident. It was rehearsed. I ignored it. Because I wanted the surgery. Because I needed it. Because after 11 months, you don't start questioning things right before the finish line. But now I was sitting on my couch, staring at that locked document uploaded at 3:12 a.m. Internal Review Update. And suddenly, all those small moments didn't feel random anymore. They felt connected. So I went back into my patient portal, started clicking through everything. Appointments, notes, test results, looking for anything that stood out. Anything I might have missed. And that's when I noticed something strange. A gap. There should have been a pre-op clearance note from the day before surgery, standard procedure, final confirmation. But it wasn't there. No note, no sign-off, nothing. Just missing. That's not normal. Hospitals document everything, every step, every approval, especially before surgery. So why was that one piece gone? I leaned back, staring at the screen. And for the first time, I asked a different question. Not what went wrong, but what were they trying to erase? Because canceling a surgery is one thing, but removing records? That's something else entirely. And then I remembered the email I had just sent. Not emotional, not aggressive, just a formal request for all records related to my case, including internal documentation, including review notes, including anything they hadn't shown me yet. At the time, it felt like a small step, controlled, reasonable. But now I realized what I had actually done. I hadn't asked them for an explanation. I had forced them into a position where they either had to give me the truth or explain why they couldn't. And something told me they weren't ready for that. The next morning, I woke up expecting something. An email, a response, anything. But there was nothing. No reply, no notification, no acknowledgement at all. At first, it felt like they were ignoring me. But then, something changed. Not in my inbox, in my patient portal. I logged in out of habit, and for a second, I thought the site was glitching. Because the document, the one labeled Internal Review Update, was gone. Completely gone. Not locked, not restricted. Gone. And that's when the silence stopped feeling passive and started feeling intentional. Because they hadn't just ignored my request, they had reacted to it. And the question wasn't if they were hiding something anymore. It was, how far were they willing to go to keep me from seeing it? I didn't accuse them of anything, so why were they acting like I did? That was the first thought that hit me the moment I saw the document disappear. Because, let's be clear, I hadn't threatened anyone. I hadn't mentioned lawsuits. I hadn't even said the word mistake. All I did was ask for my records. Something every patient has a legal right to. So why did it feel like I'd just tripped some kind of silent alarm? I refreshed the portal again. Still gone. The internal review update that had been there the night before, time-stamped 3:12 a.m., impossible to ignore, had completely vanished. Not hidden, not restricted. Erased. Now ask yourself this. If it was nothing important, why remove it? Hospitals don't delete documentation casually. They archive, they lock, they restrict access, but they don't just make things disappear. Unless that thing wasn't supposed to exist in the first place. By noon, I still hadn't received a response to my email. No confirmation, no automated reply. Nothing. But the system had changed, and that told me more than any message could have. They saw it. They read it, and they moved. At 2:17 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Hi, is this Maya Chen?" The voice was calm, polished. "Yes." "This is Daniel Brooks from Hospital Administration. We received your request and would like to schedule a time to discuss your concerns." Concerns. Interesting choice of word. "I didn't mention concerns," I said. A brief pause, then, smoothly, "Of course, we just want to ensure we address everything properly." Everything. But they still hadn't told me anything. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning, in person. Not a phone call, not an email response. They wanted me there. That alone told me this wasn't routine. The next day, I walked back into the same hospital, but everything felt different. Not because it had changed, because I had. The conference room was on the administrative floor. No patients, no nurses rushing by. Just quiet hallways and closed doors. Inside the room, 3 people were already waiting. Daniel Brooks, the man from the phone, mid-40s, neutral expression. A woman introduced as legal counsel. Late 30s, observant, didn't say much. And a third man I had never seen before. "Dr. Patel," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm here to review your case." Review. Another interesting word. We sat down, and immediately I noticed something. No one mentioned the canceled surgery. Not directly. Daniel started. "First, we want to apologize for any confusion regarding your procedure." Confusion. Not cancellation. Not error. Confusion. He continued, carefully. "There was a need for additional internal review prior to proceeding. Out of an abundance of caution, the surgery was postponed." There it was again. Review. But still no explanation. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. Simple. Direct. "What changed at 3:12 a.m.? Silence. Not long, but long enough. Daniel glanced at the legal counsel. She gave a subtle shake of her head. Dr. Patel looked down at the table. And just like that, the tone in the room shifted. Daniel smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. "I understand you have questions, and we're committed to transparency. Then answer the question," I said. Still calm, still controlled. Another pause. Then the redirection came. "As we mentioned, this was a precautionary measure. That wasn't my question." Now the tension was visible. Not dramatic, not loud, but tight, controlled, careful. Because they weren't just choosing their words, they were avoiding something. Dr. Patel finally spoke. "We're currently reassessing certain aspects of your imaging to ensure the best possible outcome." Reassessing. Present tense, meaning it wasn't resolved, meaning something had already been found. "So something changed," I said. "No," Daniel replied quickly. "We're just being thorough." Too quick, too rehearsed. And that's when it clicked. They weren't explaining because they couldn't, not without saying something they weren't ready to admit. I leaned back slightly, studied their faces, and for the first time since this started, I felt completely certain about one thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was containment. "Okay," I said. No argument, no escalation, just acceptance. And that seemed to relax them slightly. But inside, I had already decided my next move. Because if they weren't going to explain it voluntarily, I was going to make sure they had no choice. As the meeting wrapped up, Daniel said, "We'll follow up with you once the review is complete." Of course they would. On their terms, on their timeline, controlled. But what they didn't realize was that timeline no longer belonged to them. Because later that afternoon, I filed a formal request, not just through their system, through channels they couldn't quietly manage. And this time, they wouldn't be able to make anything disappear. The problem wasn't me. It was what they found, and what they almost ignored. That realization didn't come from anything they said. It came from what they refused to say. After that meeting, everything changed, but not in the way you'd expect. No sudden explanations, no apology emails, no clarity. Instead, everything became slower, more careful. Every message I received felt like it had been reviewed 3 times before it reached me. I filed the formal request that same afternoon, not just through the hospital's portal, but through a patient records access channel they were legally required to comply with. Time-stamped, documented, tracked. This wasn't something they could lose. 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th day, I got a response. An email. Attached files. Partial records. That word stood out immediately. Partial. I opened the documents anyway. Page after page of familiar information. Test results, appointment summaries, physician notes. Things I had already seen before. Things that didn't answer anything. It almost felt intentional. Like they were giving me just enough to say they complied, without actually revealing anything new. But then, halfway through one of the reports, I saw a single line that didn't belong. Imaging discrepancy. Requires reevaluation prior to procedure. I read it once, then again, slower. Imaging discrepancy. Not minor variation, not routine check. A discrepancy. And suddenly, everything started aligning. The extra scans weeks earlier, the hesitation in that phone call, the missing pre-op clearance note, the 3:12 a.m. upload. Something had been wrong, not with me, with the information they were using to operate. I kept reading, carefully, slowly, looking for anything else. And that's when the timeline began to form. Late-night scan review, flag raised, internal discussion, decision made, all within hours of my surgery. Now, think about that. If they discovered something significant enough to cancel a procedure at the last possible moment, why wasn't I the first person they told? Because they weren't thinking about me first. They were thinking about something else. And I still didn't know what that was. Not completely. Another email came in the next day. More documents, more fragments, still incomplete. But buried deeper this time, inside internal communication notes, there was something different. Not polished, not formatted for patience. This was internal language, direct, unfiltered. And one sentence stood out. Proceeding would expose prior diagnostic oversight. I stopped reading. Because that wasn't just a medical note. That was an admission. Oversight, meaning something had been missed. Earlier, before the surgery was even scheduled. And if they had gone through with it, that mistake wouldn't just exist quietly in a file. It would become visible, obvious, unavoidable. So they stopped. Not when they first noticed something was off. Not during those additional scans weeks earlier. Not during the phone call where they hesitated. They stopped at 3:12 a.m., hours before cutting into me. That's how close it was. And now the real question wasn't just what went wrong. It was, how long had they known? Because if that discrepancy didn't appear overnight, then someone had missed it, ignored it, or misunderstood it. And for 11 months, I had been preparing for a surgery based on that mistake. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Not shocked, not even angry, not yet. Just clear. Because now, finally, the pieces fit. They didn't cancel my surgery to protect me. They canceled it because they had no choice left. And if I hadn't sent that email, if I hadn't asked for those records, would they have ever told me? Or would I have just been rescheduled and never known how close I came to something going very, very wrong? I looked back at the sentence again. Proceeding would expose prior diagnostic oversight. That was the moment everything shifted. Because now, it wasn't about getting answers anymore. It was about what happens when the truth is already in writing and they can't take it back. They didn't stop my surgery because they chose to protect me. They stopped because they ran out of time to hide it. Once I saw that sentence, proceeding would expose prior diagnostic oversight. Everything stopped being confusing. It became structured, clear. Because that one line answered every question I'd been circling since that morning in the hospital. Here's what actually happened. Months earlier, long before my surgery was ever scheduled, my imaging had already been reviewed, multiple times, by different people. And somewhere in that process, a critical detail was either misread or missed entirely. Not something obvious, not something dramatic, but something important enough that it changed the entire basis of the surgery they had planned for me. So for 11 months, every appointment, every recommendation, every reassurance I was given was built on incomplete information. And then came the final scans, the ones they ordered just weeks before surgery, the ones they called routine. They weren't routine. They were a second chance, because during that final review, late at night, just hours before my procedure, a radiologist noticed something didn't line up. A discrepancy, small but undeniable. That's what triggered the 3:12 a.m. update. That's what started the internal review. That's what led to the conversation I was never supposed to hear. And here's the part that matters most. They didn't immediately tell me. Instead, they discussed it internally. They compared notes, reviewed prior scans, looked at what had been documented and what hadn't. And eventually, they reached a conclusion. If they went ahead with the surgery as planned, it wouldn't properly address my condition. In fact, there was a real risk it could make things worse. But stopping the surgery came with its own problem. Because the moment they acknowledged the discrepancy, they would also be acknowledging that something had been missed earlier. That's the oversight. So they made a decision, not a medical one, a controlled one. Cancel the surgery, delay the explanation, contain the information. That's why no one looked me in the eye that morning. That's why I got no answers. That's why the document disappeared the moment I asked for it. They weren't ready to explain it, because explaining it meant admitting it. But the email I sent, it changed that. Because once I formally requested those records, they couldn't just keep it internal anymore. They had to respond, and more importantly, they had to document that response. That's how I got the truth, not through a conversation, through their own words. Now here's what happened after, because this part matters just as much as the reveal. Within a week of those documents being released, the tone from the hospital shifted completely. No more vague language, no more delays. I was contacted again, this time with specifics. A full reevaluation was scheduled. Different specialist, different department. Dr. Reeves? He wasn't part of it. I never saw him again. But I didn't need to, because his absence said enough. The hospital also addressed the financial side, quietly but clearly. All additional testing? Covered. Follow-up consultations? Covered. Any future procedure related to this case? Also covered. No one said the word fault. But they didn't need to. Internally, I later learned an investigation had been opened. The imaging process, the review chain, the decision-making timeline, everything was being examined. Not publicly, but thoroughly. And my case? It became part of that process. Used, I was told, to revise how discrepancies are flagged and escalated before surgical procedures. Now let's talk about me. A few weeks later, I sat in a different office, different doctor, different tone. Dr. Elena Patel, early 40s, direct, transparent. No rehearsed language. No avoidance. She walked me through everything, clearly, step by step. And the conclusion? I didn't need immediate surgery. Not the one they had planned, at least. There were alternative approaches, less invasive options to try first, ones that aligned with what my condition actually required. I remember sitting there, listening, and feeling something strange. Not anger, not relief. Something in between. Because on one hand, I had avoided a procedure that might not have helped me. On the other, I had come incredibly close to going through with it, without ever knowing. That's the part that stays with you. Not what happened, but how easily it almost did. That night, after that appointment, I went home and opened my laptop again. Same one I used to send that email. I found it in my sent folder. Still there. Short, simple, controlled. No emotion, no accusation, just a request for the truth. And I realized something. That email didn't change what they did. It didn't undo the oversight. It didn't rewrite those 11 months. But it did one thing that mattered. It made sure I wasn't the last person to know. And in situations like that, sometimes, that's the only control you actually have. I finally took off the hospital wristband that night. It had been sitting on my desk the whole time, not as a reminder of what happened, but of how close it came to happening differently. And before I threw it away, I looked at it one last time and thought, not about the surgery, not about the mistake, but about that moment. 11:18 p.m. Cursor blinking. One message. Because in the end, that was the moment everything changed.